Hello, Endeavour here. So today I'm speaking with one of my buddies from Australia, Tacitus Today. I've had a discussion with him before on my channel, and I thought it was a good one. So I thought it'd be good if we spoke again. So how are you doing today, Tacitus?
I'm doing pretty good. It's early morning here. It's the middle of summer in Sydney, and there's a swimming pool out there beckoning to me, and so yeah, it's all's good. We like summer down here.
I won't keep you too long. I won't keep you too long then.
I,
I
I
wish I
understand you.
certainly
You
wish
got
it
a
was
lot of
summer
snow up
here.
there.
Uh-huh. But I what I wanted to talk about was about NGOs and about kind of the non-governmental aspect to globalization and to kind of the globalist agenda and how it's being pushed. And because Tacitus had made a video, and you should subscribe to his channel. He has an interesting channel about NGOs and really how much money is behind them and kind of the agenda that they're pushing. So I guess I'll let you start off. What exactly did you observe with the story that you told about the NGO on your channel?
Well, look, NGOs are getting into everything. The education department, government, they're just all over the place now. There's barely an aspect of life we're in that doesn't have NGOs playing a prominent role. So I think you saw the vid. Was there anything in there that you'd like me to focus on?
Well, first of all, I guess the amount of money that people are being paid by these NGOs, and secondly, the ideology that's coming out of them. So, what are they teaching people?
So I guess the way we can look at this is pro-globalization governments are outsourcing a lot of the globalization foot soldier work to NGOs. That's probably sort of how we can see it. So when you see, Greta Thunberg, a lot of the people behind her are working for all sorts of different globalist organizations, pushing and promoting, and they're working for the media. And there's sort of a round robin where they're working in government, media, academia, back to working for Greta Thunberg, back to an NGO. So there's this constantly a moving group of people all promoting globalization within that wider NGO sector.
Yeah, so what you're kind of seeing is this kind of global network of organizations which are forcing an agenda across borders. So, you can look at something like Amnesty International. You can look at something like well, the most famous one is the Open Society Foundation. And then you can look at all these things from the UN, and they all seem to be pushing the kind of globalist agenda throughout the Western world, really. And I think that what's interesting about the threat that we face today is that when we think of government tyranny and when we think of like totalitarianism, we always think of that coming from a national government. We always think of things like censoring the media. We always think of things like forcing an ideology through the state. But what we're kind of having today is that ideology and that kind of censorship, the propaganda coming from the private sector. Would you say that you notice that the private sector seems to be even more and now it's coming from the public too, but would you say that the private sector today seems even more in favor of the kind of agenda that's being pushed today?
Oh, absolutely, and it's very closely coordinated. You see things like, say, um, the government or an NGO will hire a gender studies department in a university, a Western university, to say that racism is worse than it's ever been, or wife bashing, or this or that, or something that's certainly negative to white males. They'll produce an alleged study, which will be pure propaganda. And then when that is released, it's released in coordination with the government of that country, so that the politicians are up making announcements within seconds. They've got lengthy prepared speeches denouncing racism, and they'll cite that particular report as being the justification or the reason or the evidence that these things are going on, and they've got their speech prepared. Then there's legislation appears in the parliament within minutes almost of that announcement. So that clearly shows the level of coordination in between NGOs and the government and so on. So they're all on the one side, including the media, by the way. They're all on the one side of pushing this globalization narrative and forcing it on the Western population. And the NGOs are sort of, if you like, the third pillar of this. So There's the media is the one pillar. There's the governments themselves, which have been infiltrated by globalists and globalist attitudes, and of course there's outsourcing I mentioned a moment ago, where the NGOs are becoming, like the Antifa and various other groups, Amnesty you mentioned, and the Open Society. So they're all working in reasonably good coordinated fashion to continue this wall of one narrative, and they've been reasonably successful at it, and I think this has been slowly sort of permeating and bubbling since probably around the time that President Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to all those Mexican illegals. That was probably sort of around the serious beginning. You can even go back a little further to, again, Ronald Reagan, interestingly, doing the divorce laws in California, saying that women should default receive at least 50% of all the assets, regardless of contribution, that sort of thing, which incentivized women to consider divorce as a feasible option, whereas maybe they wouldn't have previously. So all this has been sort of bubbling along, and particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, the NGO sector has just multiplied out of all proportion. And if I look at, say, the year 2000, there was maybe 5%, if that, almost no jobs were, no well-paying jobs existed for NGOs 20 years ago. Today, nearly 50% of the best-paying jobs in the nation are NGO jobs, and it goes to show you not only how prominent NGOs have become during that time, but how affluent they are. An NGO of 20 years ago couldn't have dreamed of paying the big bucks to anybody there, but today they can't pay the big bucks, and it's not now unusual to see an NGO operative that's being paid $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. And now, if you've got a number of people on the payroll being paid that sort of, you've got to be bringing a lot of dollars in the door. Otherwise, you just can't afford to carry a payroll of that size. So that just shows how affluent they are and how all-pervasive they are, and how they're permeating all different aspects of society, and of course the body politic as well. Now, years ago, they could get called out. A media, an independent media would say, "Hey, look what's going on here," and they could call it out, and they could give them a good going over in the press. But the media are owned by the globalists now as well, so that there's none of this calling out. There's none of this bringing these matters to the attention of the public. And we've got to ask, why is so much money pouring into the NGO sector? Why are they so very committed to the globalisation initiatives and the straight talking points of mass migration, denigration of straight white males, and so on? So it's a big issue. It's a huge issue, and I'm glad we're talking about it. It needs I think, a lot more coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, one point that one of my friends he has a YouTube channel called Charlemagne. What he pointed out was that when you think of like a dictatorship with, a dictator who basically he makes the rules, he says what goes, and, if you disagree with him, well, tough. What he pointed out is that in many ways, the system we have today is actually more difficult to actually resist, because instead of having like authority being passed down from a centralized source, which you can easily identify. I mean, say like in a dictatorship, I don't know, like if we say Iraq under Saddam Hussein, it was pretty obvious that Saddam was calling the shots. What we have today, though, is it's not really coming from a government, but the government is like, so decentralized. It's supposedly democratic, but it doesn't follow the will of the people. It's not exactly coming from just the media, not just the NGOs, not just the education system, but kind of a culmination of all of them. And it kind of creates this dark power that you can't really describe who exactly is pulling the strings, but it is a lot more effective in many ways than any system of control that I can think of before. Because you can just the attitude and the whole mood across the Western world today is one of fear, that everyone knows that they can't step out of line, they can't go against political correctness, or else it means the end of their career, or in some cases it can mean a jail sentence. But we supposedly live in this liberal democratic society, and it's just really interesting that we kind of have this interesting yet terrifying that we kind of have this creeping totalitarianism, but it's really kind of being facilitated by the private sector, even in some cases even more so than by the government. I mean, for example, in the United States, they don't officially have hate speech laws, so you can't go to jail for what's considered hate speech in other countries. However, I mean, if you have a politically incorrect thought, you're still going to have your life ruined. So you're still going to get fired from your job. You'll get smeared by the media. You'll have people, you'll have them turn your friends and family against you. You'll get doxxed, put on like things like SPLC. So in effect, you really don't have freedom of speech because it's like, well, the government won't arrest you if you say something politically incorrect, but we're going to ruin your life, so you're not going to say it anyway. So we kind of have this like decentralized totalitarianism coming from the private sector, I find.
Oh, absolutely. I guess it's receiving support from governments. I remember when Donald Trump was first elected, and they had all those pussy hat marches, as they called them.
Mm-hmm.
And there were certain judges in courts of law in the United States who were wearing pussy hats in sympathy with these activist marches who were being funded by Soros and all that sort of thing. So in order to achieve, there's certain building blocks in Western society. So in order to achieve its dismantling, you have to neutralise or I believe, move those or minimise those building blocks. Now, due legal process is one of them. You have someone says you robbed a bank down the road or something. They've got to prove that you did it. They just can't say you did it and throw you in prison or something. That's what's called due legal process. They have to
Mm-hmm.
produce evidence. You've got the right to cross-examine and all that sort of thing. Now, due legal process has effectively been removed, and these red flag laws that people talk about are one of the ways it's done, where they produce a given. We all know that fascists are everywhere. For example, the leftists will say or assert, we all know that fascists are everywhere. That's a given. So fascists don't deserve legal rights. So we can do these red flag laws to arbitrarily, silence or imprison or detain or whatever. And we can do all that because they're fascists, and we've got a right to do that. And if they've got a problem with it, then they can mount a legal defence. So we, the government, can act administratively and unilaterally and instantly. But if you oppose what we want to do through the courts, that we've perverted and subverted, if you oppose that, you've got to mount a full legal defence, which could cost you, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or whatever. So they do this reversal of burden of proof, and we can see the pussy hats thing I mentioned, but say in the case of Antifa getting arrested, when they bashed up Andy No, that gay Asian journalist, I think he's in Portland or somewhere around that part of the US. I don't know how many of those guys got arrested, but what I've also noticed is there are lawyers in the crowd that follow around these Antifa people. They're part of the scrum, if you like, that goes out to create havoc. So the Antifa activists go around, they'll bash people up or smash shop windows and so on. If they do get arrested, then these lawyers can straight in and get them out of prison almost straight away. And if there is they're dragged back into court for a judgment, then the lawyers acting on behalf of Antifa will make sure there's no recorded charge. And the courts seem to treat them very leniently. You also see the same thing, say, climate change activists. And you may have seen that a little while ago in Australia, these climate change activists would glue themselves to the main intersection or something like that and stop and create absolute traffic chaos in the morning. And they think they've got the right to do that. The courts treated them very, very leniently. They were getting off with $50 fines, no conviction recorded, that sort of thing. And some of these people have been arrested 10, 15 times and dragged into court. So we find that with this activism, this activism, NGO activism, they need protection from the law. They need protection from the consequence of their actions. And so the government is, and this is coming back to the outsourcing. They're outsourcing the activism. No, it wasn't us. We didn't do it. It was them. So they're able to do this. But at the same time, these people aren't getting consequences of their actions because the courts are treating them very leniently. And the reason they're treating them leniently, I believe, is because the courts are hopelessly politicised now, and due legal process is all thrown out the window. The whole thing is to do with allowing this activity and protecting it. And you probably notice, and we see it in Australia, if any straight white guy fights back against Antifa, he's the one that gets arrested, and he'll get a 6-month suspended sentence and a $2,000 fine. Where the Antifa guy or Antifa people are attacking him, they'll get, as I say, a $50 fine and a slap on the wrist. And so that's how the NGOs are getting away. I think they're activists and they're getting protected. Now that can't be accidental. There must be some sort of coordination between the government and the media and these NGOs to make sure that they can do this without penalty.
Yeah, because what I've noticed with Antifa is that the police will not treat them the same as they will treat right-wingers. So they will be allowed to get away with a lot more. And when I described this to a friend who was from Eastern Europe, and what I said was, the way that Western governments suppress thought is that they kind of outsource the suppression of that. They outsource that to groups like Antifa. So what you'll see is that, like you mentioned, if right wingers try to gather in any way, and even a lot of times it'll be for private events. This happened to Scansiforum this year, I believe it was Pastor, I believe in October of 2019. They were having a private event. And Antifa figured it out about it, and they showed up and tried to shut the event down. But what you'll see is that the police will just let them do it. So they're kind of outsourcing the suppression, but and it allows the state to maintain face. So what they can say is, well, we didn't do that. It was this group of leftist radicals who did it. We're not responsible for shutting this down. But in many ways, though, they're kind of doing the bidding of the state and of of course, the businesses and of the money power. But it allows those forces to kind of keep their hands clean. So it is a very effective strategy, unfortunately, to outsource that to a group like Antifa. I mean, and like for me, I think that anyone who kind of understands the problem shouldn't think of Antifa as this group of radical revolutionary communists or whatever. Just think of them as the unofficial enforcers of state power, really.
It seems that way. A year ago, I couldn't have brought myself to say that, and it just seemed so far out that no, I can't be. Our elected representatives doing this? No, I can't believe it. They represent us, and they surely wouldn't do this. But today, it's got to be one of the more plausible explanations for what's going on. I don't know if you remember Milo Yiannopoulos when he came to Australia to do some. Also, by the way, Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux, they came to do some talks in Australia, and the particular state government, which is very left-leaning, by the way, this particular state government, these hoods and thugs and Antifa turned up to try and prevent people from going into the venue and to generally make it impossible to have this public talk. And the police did nothing; they just stood by. And this, we're talking like 100 people getting either side of a 70-seater bus and shaking it and rocking it, and some pretty serious sort of violence going on. And the police did nothing. Instead, what the government did and what the police did is they said that Milo Yiannopoulos had to pay for them to be there, because Milo, just by the mere provocative nature of what he was saying or going to say, or they thought he might say, he was provoking these very reasonable, innocent, sweet, wonderful people into a level of violence, and therefore it's Milo's fault, therefore he had to pay. Now, the mental gymnastics required to reach that sort of position are just mind-boggling in themselves. But that seems to be going on not just in Sydney or Melbourne, but also in Toronto or Vancouver or Portland or Washington DC and Los Angeles or wherever. It's going on all London. It's going on all over the Western world, and so we've got to assume that it's coordinated policy to do it this way. It just couldn't be accident. And on the due legal process thing, due legal process is one of the great foundations of Western civilization. It means, as I mentioned a moment ago, that if you want to put someone in prison or shut them up or restrain them, or restrict their movement, restrict their freedoms in any way, you've got to take it to an independent court of law and through due legal process.
Oh, hello?
Hello, did you just switch speakers or something there?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
All right. I don't know.
okay.
It's something. Anyway, this due legal process thing is something that we've lost. That's what governments have removed in order to protect the Antifas and so on. You also notice in certain cases where um, a politically contentious case is being brought to a court, and a very activist judge, an Obama appointee or something, a very activist judge is found to hear the case, and the case is heard along ideological lines where, well, we think Donald Trump is a racist, therefore we can say this legislation is racist, therefore I'm going to strike it down. Now that defies all principles of law. But you got to find a very activist judge who would do that. And these cases magically seem to be appointed the most activist available judge when it should be a random thing that the clerk of courts allocates or whoever's available. But they seem to be able to find these very activist judges to hear these cases, and thus they're able to create legal precedents, which in turn support Antifa the next time around, or support the activist NGO globalist activity the next time around. So if anyone's thinking about how do we protect Western civilization, how do we protect against globalization, think due legal process. If you've got an impeccable, absolutely impartial, pristine due legal process, then it's one of the best protections against what's going on at the moment, and something sort of worth thinking about that we've lost. And again, it's part of this NGO government and media merging to undermine the white societies. And it's only the white societies that are being forced into this level of globalization. I'm not aware of any other non-white society that's being forced to take citizens other than their own genetic stock into the mix. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, for me, one thing that I've been talking about a lot on my channel is the Enlightenment and of kind of liberalism and liberal democracy and its foundations. And one conclusion I've come to is that I have very little faith in that actually being, in really our rights being upheld. So, like you mentioned, due legal process. It is a very important foundation of a free society, absolutely. But I just wonder how much faith I actually have in that being fairly enforced, because the point I had made is that in one of my videos, the video I made about human rights, was that your human rights our human rights today. Human rights are something that's kind of interpreted by a culture. It's interpreted by a societal foundation, and oftentimes that might be a religion or something. It used to be Christianity was very influential, but today it's, like we mentioned, it's these NGOs, it's these legal scholars, it's these universities that are deciding what human rights are and what isn't. And the point I made is that it's always going to be interpreted through the anti-white, cultural Marxist lens that this ideology is really founded on. So, like you had mentioned earlier, they're going to say, well, this person doesn't have due legal process because they're racist, therefore we can throw this person in jail, or we can ruin their life, or whatever. That they'll find a way around it with an activist judge or something like that. I just, like, for me, I have very little faith in that actually being upheld because of the agenda that's being pushed. And then secondly, the other problem we have is that due legal process only really applies to government action. And like I had mentioned, a lot of the authoritarianism we have is coming from the private sector. So what you kind of have is that you'll have, I mean, they can say again, we're not throwing you in jail, we're not arresting you, but we're going to ruin your life, and you have no say about that because you said something politically incorrect. Well, we're going to take away your job. We're going to make sure you never find another job. We're going to harass you. We're going to cut out your tongue. We're going to take you, ban you from all social media platforms. Like, for example, I'm sure you know about Blair Cottle in Australia. He's been essentially depersoned in every way, shape, and form from basically all the platforms because they're just trying relentlessly to shut him up. And the problem is that he actually has gotten in legal trouble I think he was the first person charged with the hate speech legislation down there. But in addition, like, you don't have really access to these platforms because it's a private institution, and there really is no legal defense for them, not silencing you or getting you fired from your job or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's my understanding, at least, of the Blair Cottle case was he again. I'm going from memory here, but he was protesting about the spread of mosques in Australia and how much of the mosque was being paid for by taxpayer money. And as I understand it, he objected. He objected to that. So I was demonstrating, and him and I think some of his colleagues were charged with alleged hate speech or hateful acts or something of that nature, and and in what some may say is an activist court, he was found guilty and appealed it, and as I understand it, found that the original judgment from the alleged activist court was upheld. So I think that's where, as I understand it, again, that's where that one is. But this idea of that someone can say white people, say the most terrible things about white people, and that's okay, and no one cares about it. But do what Blair Cottle was alleged to have done in that thing there, and suddenly it's an offence. And interestingly, too, the government in this case, as I understand it, became the actual. They were the ones that said that they had a grievance. So instead of there being a legitimate grievance expressed and say, I don't know, somebody having to go into court and prove it, that wasn't the case. The government actually acted as a litigant on behalf of these supposedly aggrieved people. So the reality is that governments are now interceding here to make sure that a precedent is created to shut up people who, for example, may disagree with mass immigration to the West or something like that. And so they're gradually through smaller precedents creating illegality that previously didn't exist. And coming back to the concept of red flag laws, and it's coming up in the US at the moment, say with things like gun laws, where some states are saying if somebody has committed any sort of misdemeanor and they illegally own a firearm, that firearm can be forcibly taken from them. Or if any member of the public says, I think so-and-so down the road's behaving a bit sus at the moment, then the police can just arbitrarily, unilaterally take the firearm away based on these that you might be a problem later. It could be, we don't know you're not, but somebody said you might be, this sort of thing. That's equivalent to, I don't know, Chinese whispers in the schoolyard, for goodness sakes. I don't know what legal standing anyone thinks it should have. But so these red flag laws are a way the government bypasses, again, due legal process. So you say, well, no, you've still got your rights because you can take this to court if you want. You can oppose us in court. Sure, it's a 2-year waiting list, and sure, it's going to cost you $50,000. But hey, you've still got your access to the legal system. But they can act administratively and cheaply. You have to act expensively, and over the longer term, they can act immediately. And they don't have to prove their case. They can just say, we say there are grounds. And this comes back to the government in Australia, in this case with Blair Cottle, saying, we say there are grounds to criminalise your action, and we don't have to prove it. And so it goes through an alleged kangaroo process. And next thing you know, he's got a record. They've created a precedent there. So when the next case comes up, there's now a precedent that a court can refer to. So, well, that judge decided that, we'll use that precedent. So by creating these precedents, which is a very organised system, by the way, around the world, this is NGOs also play a big part in this. By creating these little minor precedents all over the place, they've then got a system that is completely opposed to the due legal process we spoke about. It's an interesting way of undermining and emasculating the intent of independent and impartial law. This use of red flags and precedents and so on, and it's quite well done. It's happening a lot around the world, not only in Australia but US and Canada and so on. And again, this comes back to this NGO thing. It's part of their shtick, but putting that whole thing together.
Yeah, we have this one organization in Canada called I think what's it called again? The Canadian Court of Human Rights, or they have different provincial ones, like they have an Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, and this stuff is just cultural Marxist kangaroo court trash. Like basically, if you want to know what decision they're going to come to, it's basically whatever's the most anti-white decision possible. That's basically what the ruling is going to be. We had one really interesting case where A native woman had literally yelled the word "I hate white people" and punched a white woman in the face, and one of these judges ruled that that was not hate speech. And I mean, that was a famous case from a few years ago. Well, maybe not famous enough because it was obviously not talked about in the media, but it was just one of the blaring contradictions. And what you have to understand with these institutions is, you, I think that what the best mindset that people in our sphere, in our kind of sphere of politics, need to understand is that our institutions are under enemy occupation. So we can't expect to be treated fairly by the mainstream institutions anymore because they are very much aligned to push a certain agenda. And for me, what I'm more interested in is the idea of power and really how the right wing can wrestle away power from these all these organs of power that seem to be just pulling our society in one direction, be it the media, the university system. What would you say is kind of the I guess what would you say is kind of the answer? What would you say is the way out of it?
Well, just coming back to what you're saying about, say, human rights commissions, if you look at all these so-called courts or commissions or tribunals of what they call today social equity, they're all stacked and populated with radical leftists, screaming leftists. Now, the government has to make those decisions. So the elected government of the day, maybe in Canada, the Attorney General, or in the provinces, the Attorneys General in the provinces have to say, okay, we've got this commission. It's going to have, I don't know, 10 commissioners or whatever. We're going to put them in there. What we're going to do is we're going to pick the most radical leftist, anti-white male hating people we can possibly find and put them in there. So that decision has to be made. Now, why are they making that decision? What's in it for them? And so the NGOs must be controlling. If you look at the amount of people working in a minister's office in the government, how many of those are NGO freeloaders or just on for the ride? There's a lot of them are, and you see them come out of. There was one of Jeremy Corbyn's advisors a few years ago turned up with when all those Mexican or Central American caravans were going to the US border. He was one of Jeremy Corbyn's advisors. He went to work for an NGO, and then he turned up in the middle of these caravans organising those. That's how these people round robin into all these sort of different things. So there's all these activists in a minister's office saying, well, you should employ these people as commissioners in here, and they're all activists. So because the activists are all stacked in, one of the first places I believe to start is insist on due legal process is absolutely impartial and independent. None of this social equity bullshit. It's due legal process. Then the people have to be appointed to these commissions, tribunals, courts, and the public service on the basis of their commitment to public service is, well, that's an obvious one, I guess, but commitment to public service and also their impartiality as it once was. Remember that used to exist. That's been totally corrupted, and our government's gone along with it. So insisting that every politician and every person you vote for, this is the standard we expect of you, and to insist on that and insist so actively. And it requires a fair bit of organisation. The other side, the globalisation side, is massively funded. They're generously funded. Those printed signs and all that organisation for all these marches, it comes from somewhere, and so the money needs to be followed there. But a lot of people know it's already, George Soros or Amnesty or whatever, or Oxfam or something. So the idea of the way to stop the further creep of power is to insist on this independence. Now, having insisted on it and being able to enforce it, that's another thing. They're two different things, and I don't know how quickly a change could occur, whether the current globalisation thing collapses under its own weight and its contradictions because it's so anti-organic to how human society exists that it's got to fall to pieces at some point. But waiting for it's no good. How can we do that? I think it's insisting our policy. Look, we've got to vote for people who are going to look after the interests of the local populace, as Donald Trump talks about, and also are impartial in their dealings. And this should be a requirement of any of the jobs these people hold. It shouldn't be necessary for the populace to insist on it, but it's actually got to that point. But I don't know if that can work in any short term. Did you have any ideas of how things could be turned around with some sort of short-term meaningful change?
Well, in the short term, no, I don't think that. I think that any meaningful change is still probably another, uh, probably another several years away. I think that this next decade is going to be a big one. It's going to be, I think that there's going to be a lot of upheaval, and I hope that a lot of that is positive. I think though that one of the things that we really kind of need is just like you mentioned, people in positions of power who actually are going to not actually push back against the agenda. And I think that at least as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not like an expert on the law, I'm not a legal expert, um, I'm not, involved in any of these institutions. But the message I often push is that the right wing needs to learn to be ruthless, like the left wing is. So what we really need is to have organizations and have people in positions of power who are willing to use power and use it ruthlessly, because that's what the left does. They're not sitting in there thinking, oh well, how are we going to stop right wingers from organizing, but respect their rights. No, they want to destroy you at any means necessary. So what we need to do is get people in these positions of power that are willing to do that, and to understand that, we basically just need to be unashamed in pushing for what we want. And yeah, I think that a lot of that has to do with funding also. So it's gonna need a lot of people have spoken about this before. It's gonna need some kind of a right wing Soros, or even like something a fraction of that size, to actually be able to kind of create our own organizations that will lobby for our own interests. I think that's kind of how actually fighting back against what's going on right now, the problems we're discussing, really starts. In terms of short term changes, I don't think that it's going to be quick, but yeah, I think over the next decade, that kind of really needs to be the focus. A lot of that has to be on organizing, really, and using what power we have, uh, and using it the same way the left does, and not giving them an inch, because they won't give us an inch, really.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'm one of these people that believes that if the system works properly, then everything's fine. It's a case of making it work properly, and maybe I'm falling short of the measures that are needed under these very unusual and unique circumstances we're in today, in the world today. But I've got the view that if Antifa comes out and in a mob and starts committing violence, the police should arrest all of them, and they should be charged appropriately under the existing laws. And if the police did that, then Antifa would very quickly stop their the trouble that they spread, and stop their activism. That the price would be simply too high. But the reason they only keep on going is because the police won't do that. The reason the police won't do it is because they're politically being leaned on to not do it, and so on up the line. And why are activist judges appointed to courts? Why are activist commissioners appointed to human rights tribunals, and so on? That's the source of the problem, that these people being in all these roles. If independent people who were there to uphold and abide by the law were there, then a lot of these things wouldn't even exist. There wouldn't be these problems. So it's clearly a concerted effort by the globalists to undermine the means our society has of preventing that sort of misbehaviour, such as Antifa. And so our backbone, as in the Western world, sort of the backbone's been taken away by the globalists. And it's amazing how many accomplices that they had. It used to, as a student of history, used to amaze me at why, say, in various places around the world, the tribes would all turn against each other when an invader appeared, and they'd all try and cozy up to the invader in order to get a very temporary advantage, until they too got eaten up by the thing. And we see that here. It's astonishing the amount of our politicians, white, straight, male, family politicians, that have sold out to the globalists with barely a whimper. I wouldn't have thought that was possible 20 years ago. But here it is. It's not only happening, but it's now in its advanced stages, and we're even having discussions about how we can slow it down, let alone stop it or turn it around. That in itself is a tragedy that we even need to have this conversation. But something definitely needs to be done, and I agree. It's the amount of organisation involved. If you look at the states, if you start organising, whether it's a march in Dublin, and I think Dave Cullen from Computing Forever covered this. They did this protest, this march against globalisation. I think it was in Dublin, and there was a counter march, very well funded, very quickly put together. There was a counter march organised by those that support globalisation. That's how good and well funded and organised these guys are. And equally, if anyone starts rising up to the top and becoming influential in any movement to hold the globalists to account, make no mistake, they'll find themselves being targeted by the establishment. So that's the level of organisation that's needed in order to stop this. And just on revolutions generally, it's always intrigued me throughout history how revolutions. There's a lot of build-up, and with hindsight, you can say, yeah, you can see all the stepping stones to revolution. But it's easy in hindsight to say that. Looking forward at the time, it's not so easy. And the French Revolution, the year before the king had his head cut off, all the parties were sitting down having a good chat about. It might have been a bit tense, but they were talking about how they could move forward and the things they could do and the pace of reform and the concessions the crown could make and these sorts of things. They were still all sitting around the table, and there was plenty of dialogue. A year later, the king's head was cut off, for goodness sakes. That's how quickly things can, less than a year later, this is how quickly things can deteriorate and how quickly things can change. So once the fumes and are permeating the atmosphere, all it takes is that one match and bang, off it goes. So it's quite possible there could be a turn of events that none of us can see coming at the time, that radically alters the balance of power and the very trajectory that the whole thing's travelling on.
Yeah, one thing that I have been wondering about also, because you had mentioned that it just seems like all the politicians have just bought into it hook, line, and sinker. And, a lot of that I think is due to them being paid off, but also I think a lot of it is due to fear. And one of the biggest problems we have on the right is really just the fear of coming out of being public and I don't want to say the phrase coming out because it sounds like the LGBT movement, but what I mean is just being honest about your beliefs. And one thing that I hope within the next decade that we're able to do is kind of normalize a kind of right-wing nationalism, dissident right politics, and actually make it acceptable, at least within maybe not within wider society, because the people in power are going to try to stop it no matter what, but at least try to make it acceptable to the general public to be able to come out with these ideas. And I think that there needs to be this community. There needs to be a backbone. So when someone gets doxxed, when someone gets smeared by the media, there needs to be people behind them to have their back and to have protection for them, to have legal protection, to have a community there, and then to have some alternatives. So someone loses their job, something happens like that, they have a backup. There's something that they can do. And I think that would be very effective, because I am of the belief that a lot of people, especially kind of the middle class, who are the kind of the cog that the system relies on, because they need all these, middle class managers in these corporations. They need all these, maybe low level council members or something like that. They need all these people to fall in line. And a lot of them are just terrified, really, of losing their job. They know that if they step out of line, if they say something politically incorrect, they get smeared as a racist, they lose everything. So there needs to be kind of that backbone. I think that I think that what will be beneficial for us is, because I think, everyone who follows our work definitely knows that the West is going in a bad direction and that it's only going to get worse the longer it goes on. I think that if some of the people in charge had a conscience and actually realized that, yes, they're building a bad future for me, but also for my descendants, I think that a lot of them would be more likely to flip, and a lot of them would be more sympathetic to our cause. So I think that what the right wing needs to do is to actually give people the confidence to come forward. I mean, you and I are speaking under anonymous avatars on the internet, for God's sakes. I'm not, blaming anyone for doing that, because for very obvious reasons that we have to do that. But eventually, I'd like it to make it that, people aren't afraid of that anymore, and that, I guess people in positions of power can be a lot more bold, and they'd be a lot more open to our ideas.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. One of the things could be an instant, social media outrage mob, the same as the lefts have got. If within a minute or two of Trump doing anything, there's a fully fledged tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of outrage, Twitter and the social media thing generally, outrage mob that's out there denouncing, whatever under it takes a lot of mental gymnastics to get to the position they're in, but they've got the headlines ready, and they've got this instant action mob, and I think, wow, gee, you guys are quick. How quickly you came off the mark there, and really there needs to be, just supporting your point there needs to be that response from the other side saying, okay, well, we've got our outrage mob too. And just making it very much more difficult, much more expensive, and just not allowing them to dominate the narrative. Aside from, say, some of the commentators on, say, Fox or something like that, the narrative across all the mainstream media is almost vanilla. It's almost exactly the same. They're all saying the same thing, the same talking points, the same narrative is being pushed 24/7 by 90% of the media, and they've got control of that narrative. As long as they've got that much control, they can present anything that anyone does in a negative light and make some of it stick. And by the time you sort of stop to think about, well, hold on a minute, that doesn't add up to what they said about Trump or about this or about that. By the time you've sort of started to think that through, or the average citizen has, it's on to the next news cycle the next day, and they're constantly pushing the news cycle step by step, story by story, outrage by outrage, and they're moving along at such a pace that I think most of the public are getting carried along with it, but there's no counter narrative. So even if that could be established, it would be something to combat that narrative, and to as I mentioned earlier, to try and prevent activists from being put into positions of power, unless the people elect them, and then in that case, that's the people's decision, as indeed it should be. So yeah, just something. If I may, just putting in something here that we spoke about before the recording was switched on. And if your viewers and listeners are interested in this, maybe we could do another chat and sort of drill down into this later. But this idea of people, the different races integrating through marriage and procreation and so on. And a lot of you'll remember that British election advert where it was a mixed race couple that Prime Minister Boris Johnson knocked on the door and that sort of stuff in the advert. This is pushed very strongly by the pro-globalist forces that racial integration is really picking up. It's going at a huge pace, and the reality, of course, is quite different. So just to prove the theory, a colleague and I went to a very busy shopping centre that's gone from being nearly 100% white to being about 25% white within 15 or so years. And we looked at the amount of mixed race couples that we could see. And this includes people that have either come to Australia at a very young age or even born here, and they're the ones most likely to be integrating and crossing that so-called racial divide. But out of 1,000 couples, so that's 1,000 couples in a busy shopping centre, only four couples were mixed race, and two of those were a much older white guy and a younger, maybe 25 years between them, a younger Asian lady. So you probably couldn't include that as a genuine mixed race thing. So we're looking in reality at two out of 1,000, two couples out of 1,000 are mixed race. So if you'd like us to drill down further on that sort of thing in a future episode, please mention that in the comments, because there's quite a bit of raw material that's being gathered on that one, and we can explore that whole thing as well. So yeah. So yeah, just what do you think in closing off on this? What can we do?
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that it's a narrative that's being pushed, and what's going on with the whole with the narrative of the race mixing, especially being pushed in advertisements. I mean, every single advertisement is a black man and a white woman. I mean, just everyone can see that. There's that ridiculous KFC Australia commercial, which barely even showed the damn chicken that they're advertising. It was just entirely propaganda, really. And what's going on is meta politics there. So what they're trying to do is with these advertisements and with these images, it's kind of like just hammering down the same image over and over again into people's minds. And what the goal of that, what the goal of meta politics is to do is to kind of get an idea into the public consciousness. So, like you had mentioned, it's to get the idea that racial integration is just going great, and that it's just all happening naturally. We're getting rid of our racial biases, and we're all going to be in 50 years we're all just going to be this one mixed race population. That's not happening, though. Statistically, that is a lie, really. In fact, statistically, I think that white women are the most likely, or sorry, they're the least likely group to actually be involved in a interracial couple, and also they're way more likely to end in divorce. So it's not really a reality that's being pushed. And but you see that this is an example of meta politics. It's getting that idea into people's consciousness. Another example of that being pushed is the whole LGBT, transgender, drag queen story hour garbage that's being pushed in the media. One thing that Devin Stack of Blackpill pointed out is that when millennials were surveyed, they thought that the number that of the percentage of the population they thought were gay was 23%, when in reality it's only about like 3 or 4%. So they vastly overestimated the amount of gay people that there actually are, because it's just an image that's been so forced into the public consciousness through the media, through education, through meta politics, really. And I think that in terms of building a counter narrative, meta politics is our route, because our memes are meta politics, really. And what you see when you see, like for instance, when you see one of these nerd channels on YouTube, when you see one of them make a politically incorrect joke, quote one of our memes. I was listening to Morgoth and Millennial Woe speak on Millennial, and they talked about, and what Morgoth had mentioned was that a lot of the nerd channels were now starting to incorporate a lot of the the far right memes that we have. That's meta politics. That's like people. That's us kind of inserting ideas into the public consciousness. I mean, an example I can also give you, a funny example I can give is that I think I mentioned earlier in the chat that I was discussing Antiphon with a friend from Eastern Europe, and we also got into the topic of gun laws in the U.S. And I obviously didn't know how much this guy knew about it, but what I had said was that the media is not really being truthful. They're not really telling you who's committing the crime. And to my surprise, the next words out of his mouth were, despite only making 13% of the population. So that's one of our memes, that the 1350 meme is one of our memes that kind of has permeated beyond the political sphere into the public consciousness. And that's really how we get these ideas out there. And I think that that's kind of the way to get a counter narrative out there. And it's been effective so far. I mean, if you compare our means of doing that versus the means of our enemies, I mean, it's minuscule compared to that. But we actually have been effective in getting certain ideas out into the public consciousness. And I think that meta politics is definitely the route to get a counter narrative out there. And then the other thing you mentioned was putting pressure on, having kind of like a pressure mob. I know everyone's kind of sick of social media outrage, but it does work. One example of that this year was PewDiePie had decided to make a donation to the ADL. He had been smeared by them for years. They're trying to slander him without just absolute ridiculous things. I mean, the guy was pretty darn milquetoast prior to maybe this year. And then there was such outrage from the internet that he withdrew the donation. He said he's not going to do it. And that was, I think, one example of kind of the dissident right actually effectively uh, applying pressure on a public figure. And it actually was very effective in that sense that he not only withdrew the donation from the ADL, he made them look like idiots while doing it. So I think that that's kind of the route to go. We need to kind of have we need to create a meta political force. Then that's really where a counter narrative is going to come from. Have you seen that being effectively applied?
Well, effective. I'm still sort of uncertain about that, but the point you make is a very valid one. If the meta narrative is total control, so and it's where they're most susceptible to. These are the globalists and so on, but where they're most susceptible to a counter narrative being inserted. So that's an excellent point. That is probably one of the first and better battlegrounds to start with. How much discipline and coordination is needed to make it truly effective? That's another matter. And I don't know how, because it's just people going one out and one off here and there. It sort of lacks that consistency and that full-on bombardment effect that they get through controlling the mainstream media. They're constantly able to bombard the message that they want, the narrative that they want. So there'd need to be some thinking there and some getting together on it. Also, something so I agree totally with where you're heading with this. Dave, again, just coming back to Dave Cullen, one of the points he made was about coordinating a group that would be some sort of central coordinating body, if I understood him correctly, where they can sort of run the narrative. But once you start organising to that level as well, the other thing is that it'll then be subject to infiltration. So you've got a real job looking at the sort of people that are coming in and to what extent they're double agents for the globalists and that sort of thing. Sounds very Cold War, but that's really where it's got to. And so it would take a lot of discipline, a lot of thought and coordination to be truly effective. But in the meanwhile, doing it one off and one out, like PewDiePie you mentioned, that's probably all can really be done at the moment. But that equally, whilst it's a small beginning, it equally means the only place to go is up if it becomes effective. And I think it would actually, but and as that the whole thing becomes better organised, more focused, and the message is coordinated so that it true narrative. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, one thing that Greg Johnson had said was that our enemies control the media because they need to control the media. They need to have absolute control of the narrative in order to force their agenda because it's fundamentally an anti-human agenda that's being forced. So, in many ways, yeah, we're outgunned financially, but I think that one of the positives we have is that I'm of the belief that right-wing ideas are more in line with the natural order of humanity. So I think that it doesn't require as much convincing and as much propaganda to get people on board with them because you can. How much propaganda did it require to get people to think that reproduction is not that is not something important, that having children is not, you shouldn't want to have that. I mean, that's just like the very basic function of mammalian organisms, really. Sorry, biology is not my strong suit, but nonetheless, like the ideas that they're forcing are not something that come with common sense. So I do think that that's a big advantage we have, is that it's a lot easier to get kind of ideas that just line up with reality a lot more into the public consciousness, as opposed to ones that are just flat out lies. I mean, it is true that the forces we're against have to rely on lies in order to actually uphold it. So I think having the truth on your side is very effective.
Look, you're exactly right. And if we look at the fall of the Soviet Union, in order to make the Soviet state function, they had to use massive propaganda. They had to artificially change the very existence of people and the organic nature of human interaction. So So they did that, and they thought that, like the people at the apex, they thought that they were impregnating folks with their ideas. But in fact, the population just knew it was all nonsense and rubbish and bullshit, and so they they just went through the sullen, silent, resentful acceptance of things, in as much as, well, we can't change. If we say anything, we're going to get thrown in the gulag or something like that. But when communism fell to pieces and the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union disintegrated, the people, they dismissed it. The speed with which the society went back to its pre-Soviet social structure was stunning. Within months, the society was returning to how it was before the Soviets were around in terms of social organisation, and all these artificial jobs that were created for minorities and so on, they all disappeared overnight because they just simply weren't sustainable. And so this artificial world that the globalists and their flunky crony mates are creating isn't, as you say, isn't organically natural or socially natural. So at some point, the whole thing's going to default back to what is the organic nature of things. But the Soviet failure to actually change anyone's mind, or to hardly change anyone's mind, that was the starkest thing to me when it all fell apart. And the people who came out of the Soviet Union afterwards just openly said, we always knew it was nonsense. We always knew it was rubbish. We always knew it was crap. These studies that were in the Soviet newspapers saying that this academic said that such and such, they all knew it was crap, and they all knew it was political. And they all knew things were being forced artificially. But they went along with it because they just didn't have the options. But as soon as they did, of course, they threw it out. But the interesting thing was they never believed it, or so they claim. They never believed it all along. So I think we're in a situation not dissimilar now, where a lot of people are simply putting up with it, but don't really go along with it either. And I was talking to a very, well, someone who I thought was a very left-wing journalist who produces these screaming globalist, leftist, anti-male, anti-white male, anti-straight white male screeds in the media. And she was, and I was talking to her, in fact, this is a couple of years ago now, I guess, she, I just assumed she was a screaming lefty because of the stuff she writes. And there was this dinner, and we were kind of sitting next to each other. So I was chatting, assuming there'd be this radical leftist feminist. And she said, hey, no, I write that stuff because they pay me very well to do it. It's all crap. I don't believe it. I do it because I'm paid to do it. And that was it. And that shocked me, that some of the passengers that are along with this globalist thing, they may not believe in anything, let alone the globalists screed, but they're being well paid. They've got they've got their nice house in the burbs with a big mortgage, and the kids at the school. They've got this lifestyle that going along with it subsidises. They say, hey, I go along with this and I get paid well to do it, so why don't I just accept it? But they could very easily turn in the other direction. As soon as the direction of the wind changes, they'll also change. They're not believers in anything. They're just passengers on the easiest path to a bit of money. And she was like that, and that surprised me, given the vehemence of contained in her articles that I've read.
Yeah, one thing that you had pointed out was that toward the end of the Soviet Union, everyone knew that it was a system based on lies. And the thing is that, our system is based on even more lies. I mean, they were lying about the economy. They were lying about, economics and about, the working class and stuff like that. Our system, they're telling us that, gender doesn't fucking exist. I mean, it's just ridiculous. They're telling you that, well, the actual reason that, black lesbians aren't all the CEOs is because of slavery from 200 years ago. So we need to put them all in positions of power today. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And it's something that everyone really kind of knows is false. It requires a lot of mental gymnastics in order to actually believe any of this stuff. I think that what we were discussing at the beginning of the conversation is the kind of the political, the money power behind it. And I don't think that is very solid right now, unfortunately. That is very strong. But I think that the narrative is very weak. So I think my prediction kind of for the next decade is that I don't think it's going to, I don't know if, I think a lot's going to change. I don't know if the fight's going to be over in 10 years. But what I think is that they're going to lose the narrative really, because they already are. I mean, how often do you hear the phrase diversity is our strength anymore? I mean, I'm from Canada. That's like literally I'm from Toronto originally. That's literally the slogan of the city. And people have just stopped saying it because it's just such an obvious lie. I mean, how is the more different people in a country are, how does that make your country stronger? It just makes absolutely no sense. Um, and I think that just metapolitically, that I think that the right is going to make huge gains in the next 10 years. That really is the sphere that I'm more focused on. I do really enjoy, the meta political battles going on, and I think that already you can definitely tell that they're afraid of a counter narrative coming out. I mean, and even though they have enormous funding in comparison, they are very afraid of other ideas entering people's minds. That's why they need to just be so ruthless against it. So I think that what's going to change first is the meta narrative, is the idea of is that the ideas that they're really trying to force in order to justify globalization. I think more and more people are going to realize that it's just based on lies. They're going to be able to just say, well, yeah, not everything bad in the world is the fault of colonialism, racism, imperialism, white supremacy, whatever. All this all this garbage. It's obviously just not true. And I think that the real opportunity we have in the present day is getting these new ideas into the public consciousness and getting a counter narrative out there. I think that's kind of I think that's kind of been what we've been most successful at so far.
Oh yeah, and I guess even this video that we're doing now is I guess part of the counter narrative, and just on the issue of the reason black lesbians aren't all CEOs today and that sort of thing, and the slavery thing. What the misinformation and deliberate misinformation and propaganda about slavery drives me insane sometimes. When the slave, in fact, even before slavery was formally and officially ended, the slaves in the US and parts of the Caribbean as well were given the option of returning to Africa in what today is Liberia and what was it, Sierra Leone, I think maybe, like Freetown and all that sort of stuff on the west coast of Africa there, and they were given free passage to Africa, plus a free plot of land, plus free building materials to build a house for any former slave or current or former slave that wanted to go back to Africa. And not even 1% of the slaves took up the offer. They elected to stay in the United States or even in the pre United States nation days when it's still a colony. They opted to stay there rather than go back. Now this is free passage, free land and free house. That's not a bad gig, and yet they turned it down to stay in this wickedly evil, racist white. So it can't have been too bad. And even today, the African Americans are the richest Africans in the world as like a part of it as a social group. And so you'd think that on that basis there'd be a lot to say. Well, things weren't as bad as that, and whilst obviously morally undesirable in many ways, the concept of labour and labour hire and labour usage in the day, all across the Arab world and everywhere, slavery was how it was done, how you imported a labour force. But of course today, and even at the time, it's a morally undesirable way to go about things. But when you look at that in the context of the times and the fact that white people are actually bit players in the whole gig, then you see that we're being given a narrative here that's purely to promote guilt and self-loathing, not to actually redress any legitimate grievances.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like the entire talk about slavery is purely political today. Nobody cares about. What I always say is my response whenever someone says, well, slavery or your ancestors oppressed. What I just say is, look, no one cares about what happened 150 years ago. They just want to take advantage of you today, and slavery is their excuse in order to do that. But I think one thing you had actually mentioned before is that kind of their ideology is making them weaker. I mean, when you have all these diversity hires, you eventually just lose competence. I mean, you can just look at things like the armed forces, about how worse they're being made by the diversity policies, that they're literally making the police, they're literally making the militaries weaker by lowering the standards for women. I mean, Iconoclast a few years ago did a video about how incompetent the police in the United Kingdom had become, and essentially how you'll have these overweight 5'3" women as police officers, and that when they're up against a 6'2" black guy. I mean, like, come on now, like, they're not going to be able to actually perform the job the same as a man would. And I mean, one thing you notice is that that their own ideology just brings about incompetence, really.
Yeah, yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, there was a business that some years ago I was in where it was all sharp white guys in this particular section of this business, and I was in there again having a meeting with them just recently, and there's not one white or male person in that whole division, and half of them could barely speak a word of English. That's how much affirmative action goes on, and none of the people were qualified to be there, not even remotely, not even minimally, and it's not my business to tell them their business and what to do, but they've got these very, very pronounced affirmative action policies. And you see it now up close, and you look at the difference in the competence and the quality of the people, and you just shake your head in disbelief. Why would any business want to inflict that upon themselves? But as I mentioned earlier, this particular business, they've gone to the government and they've sought protection from competition. So they're going to supply certain services to the government, and provided they don't have to get to compete with other businesses, which means they can charge a much higher price, which then compensates them for the incompetence that they've got internally. Because if they had to really compete in the marketplace on who's got the best product, the best service, the quality of your people really comes to the front quickly. And if you've just got a bunch of affirmative action hires that barely know what day, what's going to be achieved? You just can't compete on that basis. So they go to the government and say, hey, give us some sort of pass here to avoid competition, and we can keep with our affirmative action policies. So as you say, this ultimately is going to fall to pieces under its own weight. In the meanwhile, though, the living standards that Western citizens have to tolerate, because we now have to pay higher prices than we otherwise would have, less competent people are coming through the ranks, which means there's fewer qualified, competent people. There's less for certain competent people to aspire to, because they can't get the job because they're white, straight male with a great pass at college or something like that, and they're going to lose out to someone that should have been kicked out of even junior high school simply because they're the wrong colour, and so on. And all this adds cost, it adds delay, it adds a burden to the commercial sector and society in general, which all reduces our standard of living. Things cost more, things take longer to do, there are less tax dollars being collected than otherwise would have, and so on. So you look at the cumulative effect here, it's all being passed, or primarily at least the cost of this transition is being passed on to white people through loss of job opportunities, increased cost of living, so on and so forth. And that's probably one of the greatest tragedies of the globalisation, that they've been able to get away with it.
This has been a good conversation.
It has. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, if you've enjoyed this, head over to Tacitus's channel and subscribe. I'll link his channel down below. Thanks for listening. Speak to y'all later.